Hey, this is Epimetheus. Today I wanted to talk about the borders of countries, principalities, empires, states in general, as they are drawn on maps. In modern times, borders are generally very clearly delineated between two different nations, although ancient states clearly marked their borders on a somewhat regular basis. It is a little less clear when defining the borders of a larger empire. Some ancient empires had a very centralized internal structure for governing the provinces and would be similar to what you would think of as a modern nation state. But that would be more of the exception than the rule. Typically, at the head of an empire would be an internal ruling class, and especially as you would move out from the nexus of the empire along their border regions, you would have subsidiary vassal kings who would pretty much be autonomous rulers. This is demonstrated in the first Persian Achaemenid Empire, where the provinces were ruled by satraps or governors, but they had considerable autonomy. As is demonstrated by Marcellus, or I don't know how you pronounce his name, but the guy who built the mausoleum at Halicarnassus, and he was a satrap in the Persian Empire, but he essentially ruled over that region of Turkey, of southwestern Turkey, as an independent king. And during the succeeding Seleucid and especially Parthian empires, decentralization was really the name of the game. This occurred in many other places, but I think the Parthians are a classical example of where you have a strong centralized warrior aristocracy, and they collect taxes from a large empire that they use for the army, and they also can raise men, but essentially they leave the entire running of the empire outside of the capital city regions up to the local governors and vassal kings. And if these subsidiary rulers failed to produce the men or money needed, then there was often a war. And if the empire was unable to take them back, it became its own independent country, as was the case with the Parthians in conjunction with the Seleucids. They had been the somewhat dutiful vassals of the Seleucids and had rebelled off and on, until successively rebelling and conquering much of the eastern portion of the empire. So here's the question. Should a vassal kingdom be included within the empire's borders? This is typically done when you see an empire's borders drawn. Vassals are typically included. And when I typically see or read about people arguing over the size of an empire on the internet, it typically comes down to, should this vassal be included or not? My opinion would be, with a couple asterisks behind it, if the people in a given region pay taxes to the central government in any sort of form, include them within the empire's borders. If not, then they're their own independent country. One of the most complicated examples of this is Armenia, during the time of the Sasanian or Sassanid Empire and the Romans. Sometimes they were on the Roman side, sometimes they were on the Sasanian side, sometimes they paid taxes, sometimes they paid no taxes. And their position between these two empires frequently and rapidly changed over hundreds of years. So this makes it difficult on some maps to say whether they were part of the Sasanian Empire, Roman Empire, or whether they were an independent state. Sometimes you had someone from the Iranian house of Sasan or an Arsacid dynasty prince on the head of the Armenian throne. Other times was a native, sometimes he was backed by Rome, sometimes he was opposed by Rome. And yeah, so it gets very, very complicated. And this is just a more clear example of something that went all over the place, not only within the Roman and Persian empires, but many other empires. And in the case of a similar time period, you have Zenobia, who I think she was the wife of the governor of Palmyra and became the empress there. In border regions, there was a small distinction between an independent king and a governor, because if you tried to assert more authority over a region very close to your enemy could use that to gain popular support among his adversary's population. And this concept is also very present in the Rashidun, Umayyad, and Abbasid caliphates, and even the British East India Company taking over India, where the process of Arab control in the Middle East or the British control in India was a very long, coercive process. It wasn't I think it's one of the major misconceptions that's pointed out is that it's pretty much these empires are taken by brute force. It's very coercive. And you see time and time again with successful empires is they come into a given territory and the local population barely notices a difference from before the conquest and the switch of dynasties from one to another. And if you go examine some of the old Mesopotamian cultures, when they would get conquered by another one, they would get a tax break to make the conquered population more pliant. And when they were conquered, local rule was often maintained, and really the only difference is who were the taxes going to. Who collects the taxes gets to pay the army and build the grand monuments. And if they maintain power for many decades or centuries, then they can forcibly exert power over the populace. And maybe to sum up, I would say, typically when you look at ancient empires, they were not as so much concerned with the micromanagement of people's lives as a modern state. But the norm was for an emperor to be content as long as a local governor could handle the people of the province and the empire in aggregate received the benefit economically of that province. And it can also be considered the amount of troops stationed in a province, but then is it just an occupied province, and once the troops left, then it became not part of the empire? And that's something too, that's another thing on maps. Sometimes they'll show and other times they won't. They'll show something as being part of an empire while there was a large military force there. And then once the military force leaves, it stops being part of the empire. And that's another whole discussion. But I think the most determinant factor is whether the empire has a level of economic control over a given region. And this is more about those gray areas. Like there's some clear black and white. If the empire is writing the laws, if there's regular troops garrisoned there, if the people there consider themselves part of the empire, of course it's part of the empire. But for those places where there's people, tribes, or kingdoms living there and they recognize the hegemony of the empire, they give them taxes, they give them their sons. Is that part of the empire? But they live under their own laws and have their own leaders. But what in the case of a vassal where they don't pay a monetary tax but are obliged to hand over a fixed quota of their children or young sons or young men to go fill the ranks of an empire's army? Are they part of that empire? And when the empire's armies march through, they're obliged to feed them. So there are so many different little cases where you could come up with all these different scenarios, but essentially that's what history is left for us, where you have all these different scenarios of all these different relationships between client states and imperial states and different levels of incorporation. Well, this has been Epimetheus. This is my second channel. Subscribe to this and my main channel where I write out scripted content, unlike this rambling diatribe that I hope you found somewhat amusing or enjoyable or thought-provoking. And let me know in the comments of what you think constitutes a given region being part of a larger empire. And a big thanks to my supporters over on Patreon. Thank you so much for watching.